After months of waiting, we've got a date.
The idea for a voice came from the people and it will be decided by the people. Today I announce that referendum day will be the 14th of October.
That leaves just 6 weeks for both camps to sway voters.
The question is a proposed law to alter the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Do you approve this proposed alteration?
In order to be successful, the referendum needs an overall majority of votes in a majority of states.
We can close gaps and make better policies by listening to the voices of communities who know the problems they face and the solutions they need.
But overall support for the voice is steadily trending down, from around 65% last year, now down below 48% in multiple national polls.
Let's leave everything on the field, no stone unturned, and let's get this done.
Polling shows WA and Queensland both inclined to vote no. Victoria and New South Wales the states most likely to vote yes, making Tassie and South Australia key battlegrounds for the referendum to be successful. Highlighted by the Yes campaign launching in Adelaide today.
When we wake up on October 15, we need to be able to look our neighbour in the eye and honestly say, we did our bit.
So we've finally got a date, but just how divisive will the next 6 weeks be?
We've got a Prime Minister who just deliberately withholding detail from the Australian public. He says that all of the detail will be provided after the vote takes place. If you don't know, vote no.
We know that well over 80% of our communities support a voice. Those who don't support a voice get 80% of the media coverage.
It is that old rule of divide and conquer that I can't stand for. I'm not going to allow a line to run straight through the middle of my family within our Constitution.
Our Australian story goes back 65,000 years. It's up to all of us to write the next chapter together. And we can start by writing one word: yes.
National Senator and No campaign advocate Bridget McKenzie is here to discuss what happens next. Senator, what is it about the voice that you're so worried about?
Great to be with you, Waleed, and great to hear the Prime Minister has announced the date that we head to referendum. As you know, I'm a very respectful no. I'm absolutely committed to reconciliation and recognition. But unfortunately, the voice and the constitutional change being proposed won't actually deliver the outcomes that are being sought. It's also being touted as quite risky. We've got constitutional experts that are very, very concerned about enshrining the voice in our founding document and the implications that will have for High Court decisions going forward.
Sorry, Senator, can I just stop you there, though? That's actually only a very small number. Over and over, we've seen former High Court justices, for example, come out and say they're not concerned about the constitutional implications of this, and where, for example, coalition politicians have cited them, they've been citing them in a misleading way.
Well, Waleed, with respect, the High Court is a small number of judges that actually determine the interpretation of our Constitution, and their judgments have very, very profound impacts across our whole nation, and Australians know that. And so they would rather our Parliament, that's elected by all of us, make decisions that impact us, rather than a handful of judges that sit off to the side, that are unelected, determining significant impacts on Australians' way of life. So even if it is a handful of constitutional experts, you can't simply dismiss that.
Well, how do you then improve the outcomes for vulnerable First Nations people then, Senator? What are your ideas?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely the question. When I was the Minister, when that young 2-year-old was raped in Tennant Creek, I was sent in by the Prime Minister to negotiate a deal with the Territory Government to actually put real infrastructure, social infrastructure on the ground in that community to make things better. And things have improved over time. Have they gotten where we all want them to be? Of course they haven't. Can we change the way we make decisions and work more deeply and in an embedded way with those vulnerable communities? Yes, we can. But it takes political will and courage.
These are not new issues or new problems that we're trying to solve. You seem to be saying it's really a matter of political will. You were in government for 9 years. Before that, the Howard government was in power for, 11? That's 2 decades. Were these 2 decades without political will? Why do we still have these problems if it's about political will only?
Well, Waleed, you know that it's not just the federal government that has jurisdiction in this area. State governments are, overseeing both the education system and the health system, which are fundamentally important to improving some of those indicators we want in closing the gap. When we were in government, we set up a procurement policy called Supply Nation, which really forced industry and government departments to hire Indigenous companies who employed Indigenous Australians, so that economic empowerment, which is so foundational for a better future, was actually incentivised through government spending.
Sure.
So there is a long way to go.
My point is,
to say that nothing,
right?
to say...
So for everything that our current system, every policy has tried to develop, this is where we currently are. The idea of the voice is for policy to be developed with the benefit of proper advice and consultation from the people on the ground. Doesn't that seem like a mechanism, a way of improving policy, of getting better outcomes?
Well, Waleed, I've said I'm a very respectful no, and that I'm committed to reconciliation and recognition, and my entire working life shows that I live that out in action. I'm also part of a political party that proportionally represents more Indigenous Australians, and as one, we knew that this was not the answer to the communities that we represent. The fact that nobody knows how these representatives will be elected, that Canberra could have potentially the same amount and number of representatives as Western Australia seems incredible to me, and a model that simply favours academic elites over local Indigenous Australians who absolutely need to have their voices heard. They need to be listened to, and we want local solutions. So why hasn't the government funded the Yipirinya Aboriginal boarding proposal in Alice Springs, a boarding school that was costing just over $10 million to help those young Aboriginal students from town camps coming into Alice Springs to get a better education? The principal said to me when I went there as Minister, we need $10 million to set this up so they don't have to go home and potentially not come back or be subjected to a lifestyle at home that isn't advantageous to their ongoing learning. And yet the Labor Party refused to fund it. So there are solutions on the ground that people could implement right now that are being proposed by Indigenous Australians and local communities, but the government isn't listening to them. So I think you can't have it both ways. You can't say you can only hear Aboriginal Australians' issues in remote communities by having the voice, because the reality is they're standing up and making themselves heard right now, and the government isn't listening.
Senator Mackenzie, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Waleed.